It's a pleasure to be here in the context of the House's exhibition programs, which I've had the great fortune of being involved with as the curator of the Misfits exhibition. It will be clear perhaps to some of you who have seen the exhibitions that what I'm going to present today kind of falls somewhere in between them. I hope not through the gaps. I'm going to start by touching on Professor James Scott's work and its possible affinities with contemporary art before considering the fugitive logic that he's identified in upland Southeast Asia. I'll then zoom in on a single artist's project as a way of opening very widely the question of how that logic might find expression in contemporary art's supposedly post-national era. Finally, I'll offer a speculative sketch of where we might look for fugitive expressions in a certain regional art history and how those expressions might indeed contribute to reshaping a regional art history. Studies in art history feature precious few agrarianists, but one need only read the opening pages of James Scott's 1998 book, Seeing Like a State, to find clues explaining his felicitous affinity with contemporary art, or at least its affinities for him. Now, I don't know whether James cares too much for modern art, though I suspect he knows more about it than I do about agronomy. But if few curators perhaps were reading him in the 1990s, these early pages are a guide to why many might be today. In a nutshell, they describe the intellectual innovations of 18th century German forestry as prototype for an order of planetary exploitation we've come to associate, fairly enough, with the state and with capitalism. The reduction of complex old-growth forests into a dressed, gridded, rationalized monoculture to maximize the yield and predictability of a single resource, timber. The stunning but relatively short-lived economic success of this radical simplification and the unsustainability of such a program, legible in the rapid expiry of its productivity. Like much theoretically informed art since the 1960s at least, Scott is keenly attuned to what doesn't appear, to what lies outside the brackets, as he puts it, of that system of rationalization, beyond the state's tunnel vision. It's unconscious or it's surplus, it's repressed others, perhaps as, for example, Rosalind Krauss saw a perspectival window beneath all of modernism's grids. Now, this marginalia is far from marginal for contemporary art and its acolytes. Indeed, Scott's account of 18th century forestry reads like a shopping list of recent art world preoccupations and cause célèbres, starting with the vulnerability of ecosystems and deleterious effects of large-scale farming and resource extraction, and ecological complexity, the delicate balance and interdependence between a system's parts, with a principled respect for life, for the animate, but less obvious players in that complex ecology, including displaced humans, especially indigenous ones, and displaced flora and fauna, and with strong sympathies for the local, a very important value in much recent art, for arcane and endangered local knowledges, manual knowledge, artisanal techniques, folk remedies, the languages and customs that encoded them, which artists these days might valorize as either communally held intellectual property, abused by multinational corporations, or as a capital unseen by the capitalists, sometimes held up as a kind of talisman against destructive practices. I'm reminded here of Pierre Clastres' 1974 essay on ethnocide, the negation of difference that he says is essential to the state, its, quote, normal mode of existence, which won't end till there's nothing at all left to change. Erin Gleeson is going to speak in a moment about one such endangered culture read through the lens of Cambodian artist Khvai Sam Nang, whose work some of you may have seen in Documenta. Scott privileges complexity over the simplification that we experience as a vague but inexorable homogenization under so-called global capitalism. In sympathy with everything uprooted, silenced, snuffed out in the name of fiscal predictability and profit, his analysis anticipates a certain contemporary aesthetics, characterized by the politics of use and counter-practice, as famously elaborated, for example, by Michel de Certeau, another avid reader of Clastres, by tactical, alternative and microeconomies, by materiality, another salient preoccupation of contemporary art, of course. For instance, in Scott's attentiveness to the byproducts of resources, the wood between the trees, so to speak, or beneath them, or born of their waste, to which the modern state tends to be blind in its rationalist, productivist zeal, by the trope of the model or the program, the reduction or rendering of the forest as a legible system, ripe for analysis and improvement by way of informatic operations, and by his emphasis on the visual and visibility. The way states came to envision their forests as resources is just one of a myriad ways that sight and observation were enjoined in the renewal of the rational developmental program of modernity in the state's secularization and centralization of power. One further affinity, though he shows that such programs were constitutive of the modern state, Scott's systems thinking quickly demands a supranational frame. Not only do ecosystems, of course, cut across political boundaries, but forestry's scientification and codification themselves, and quite rapidly, he notes, became transnational models. In our ongoing defense of diversity against creeping monocultures, it's little wonder perhaps we turn to an expert on agriculture and its histories. A cultivation that was the paradigmatic vector of a rationalization we tend now to see less as the antithesis of pre-modern enchantment, perhaps even as a kind of re-enchantment that was the flip side of modernity. Now, it was with broadly the same sympathies that Professor Scott later focused on the avoidance and countermeasures of Southeast Asian populations falling outside the brackets of the nation state. Societies of the upland zone called Zomia in 2009's The Art of Not Being Governed, one of the inspirations for these exhibitions and this program. Zomians were casualties of that epochal rationalization, a process richly thematized in the study of Southeast Asia, almost always from the state point of view, as an emboîtement or encompassment. At face value, this process ended with decolonization, by which time Zomia had been carved up into territorially discrete chunks of a Cartesian or perhaps Mercatorian geography. But what this book suggests to me, certainly when read in the spirit of Clastres, is that the Zomians' avoidance of the state and resistance to encompassment must be just as innate, just as primary or primal as the urges to form states and encompass neighbouring peoples. If Clastres was right that the annihilation of cultural alterity is somehow essential to the state, wouldn't it follow that a will to oppose annihilation is similarly inherent to non-state peoples? And as critics of the state today, and who among us can afford to be anything but, even tangled up in its webs, are our modes of avoidance really so very different from theirs? Far from being luckless roadkill on the highways of national modernity, we might rather see the Zomians as partisans of a much older and ongoing struggle against all kinds of oppressive regulation, authors, by virtue of their cultures at least, of sophisticated programs of resistance to forces of economic and cultural simplification. And yet it's important also, I think, to insist upon the non-opposition between them and the state broadly construed, to stress rather a situational dynamics of selective, negotiable, temporary belonging and contingent identification, manifest in flexible systems of social status, polycentric political landscapes, and above all, cultural plurality. This fugitive geography was not fixed, but time-based and variable, an oscillation shaped by pulses of attraction and repulsion at the edges of the state sphere of influence. Nor were techniques of evasion and flight necessarily discrete to the uplanders, but were no doubt borrowed, adapted, and hacked by other subject populations from the lowlands or brought into the state sphere from elsewhere. We even detect a certain tolerance built into the logic of Southeast Asian statecraft, allowances by which relative autonomy was entertained in order to keep buffer populations in place at the fringes as a kind of standing reserve. The state may have a totalizing logic, yet not all states, perhaps not even most, achieve total realization. We might, for example, think of the Kuomintang units who, stranded in northern Thailand after Mao's ascendancy in China, collaborated with a range of state anti-communist campaigns, but remained armed and more or less governed themselves well into the 1980s. This regional history of accommodation and nomadological collaboration sticks to the forests, mountains, and inaccessible borderlands, a geography that's alive with contradictions to this day, as we see, for example, in these 4 recent art projects dealing with histories of such collaboration in Greater Zomia, if I may call it that. My proposition is that with the constitution of modern territorially bounded nations, Zomia doesn't end, but rather modes of evading the control of states and state-like forces are developed, adapted, and sublimated once physical flight is no longer possible. The fugitive reflex may, in other words, have survived in other behaviours, in a psychology shaping relations to power, even perhaps at the heart of the state sphere of influence, informing struggles not just for formal political autonomy, but for a more subjective personal kind as well. And certain professions might have preserved this more than others, by dint of their position vis-à-vis lines of institutional coercion and patronage. Now, all this puts me rather out of sync, I'm afraid, with the discourse on contemporary art in its global extension. For as in other fields, for a good 20 years or so, the preponderance of the nation-state in the production, circulation, and interpretation of modern art has seemed to be waning. Contemporary art is characterized as a privileged vector of globalization, increasingly post-national in its outlook and habits, the many state agencies still bound up in its production and promotion as complicit in a larger assimilation. People like myself, researching contemporary art in the non-West, but often participating in that post-national conversation, share a certain melancholia. It's just not cool to always be the one insisting that in much of the world the nation is not over and done with. Clastres concludes his wonderful book, Society Against the State, with an aphorism. James cited this yesterday. If the history of peoples with history is the history of class struggle, then the history of those without history is a history of struggle against the state. But here, in my life, we seem to have an ironic inversion. Societies with art history that have somehow left the gravitational field of the nation, while those of us without much of a written record find ourselves still firmly anchored within it. Of course, it's premature to be declaring the demise of the nation. Recent events around the North Atlantic axis certainly suggest a lingering desire to make it great again, whether or not artists care to resist that. But if my years working with Southeast Asian artists have taught me anything, it's that the arts of evasion and state avoidance are very much alive, and that the internationalization of contemporary art breathes new life into them. In a moment, I'll summarize a few planes of withdrawal across which we might try to trace the fugitive reflex in contemporary art, its lines of flight. I'll refer mainly to Southeast Asian examples, but I think a more general global resonance might also be detected. So first I want to consider one very transnational project that sits comfortably within the topical ethical complex that I've just drawn from Professor Scott's work, to pose the questions: just how far might these lines of flight take us? How might the fugitive reflex have been sublimated practically, aesthetically, or psychologically? Pratyaya Pintong's Donne plus que tu prends, or Give More Than You Take, took up trending themes of the commons and global migrant labour. The artist did a 6-week tour of duty with Thai contract workers picking wild berries in Swedish Lapland, an industry reliant on the legal principle of allemansrätten, an ancient right of common access to uncultivated lands, the survival of which in the Nordic context is apparently to be put down to the absence of feudalism there and the preponderance of unenclosed forest. This is not agriculture exactly, it's organised foraging. It's the taking of a natural bounty that's there for anyone, but which has become unviable with first world labour. But the freedom to roam, as allemansrätten is sometimes known, exposes the visitors to the perils of competing claims on the land. During Pratyaya's stay, one Thai worker from another camp nearby was killed by a bear, an animal known to be fond of berries. Others have been shot accidentally by hunters. The workers conspired perhaps in a bout of anarchist calisthenics, to dismantle a hunting tower, symbol of their precarity, which the artist later expropriated and exhibited as a kind of trophy installation. The image on your left is the image of parts of the particle board that make up the walls of the hunting tower that have been stowed underneath a truckload of berries. So the colour is not blood, it's blueberry juice. When not picking berries, Pratyaya documented what he could. His photos and videos were archived online. What looks on the surface like matter-of-fact manual labour at the same time describes a more epic alienation, precipitated by the workers' radical displacement and attempted reterritorialisation. As they were fed only 1 or 2 eggs per day, much of the documentation captured their incidental searches for protein, hunting and gathering that punctuates the workday with something akin to play, angling for unfamiliar fish, stalking pheasants with a slingshot, modern-day explorers improvising in a foreign environment. In one sequence, they gather round the gleaming innards of a freshly butchered moose left behind by a hunter, amused by the challenge of identifying edible bits based on their experiences with buffalo. When they're ripped off by their Swedish employer, the artist, with his confident art world English, is thrust into the role of spokesman in a labour dispute, an advocacy that he reluctantly performs for a while, but from which he recuses himself as soon as possible, for he's no activist. His artwork depends on his partaking of the job on the same terms as the others. He doesn't trace the inflating value of their wild harvest, nor belabour the precarious work conditions. He highlights instead the conditions of possibility of this venture, from its austere calorific economy to the profit motive that migrant worker shares with transnational capitalists, seeking new global opportunities thanks to the falling costs of air travel, loosened labour regulation, and rewards lucrative enough to warrant this dangerous bivouac in another land's pre-modernity. Anselm's frontier realism, perhaps in a quite literal sense. Pratyah's exhibitions in France and Italy were built around deliberate, arbitrary abstractions of the material economy to which he'd subjected himself. Curators were tasked with making installations of unspecified waste materials, equivalent to the weight of berries that the artist picked, reported each day by SMS. Kind of blind conversion of quotidian labour from the wilderness to the cosmopolitan Kunsthalle. Now, looking at this through the lens of flight would lead us to emphasise a couple of things. First, formally, like most of Pratyah's work, it's easy to situate in a long, more or less Western tradition of dematerialisation, of modern art's evasions of the commodity form and the reification of the culture industry by way of, for example, land art, performance, conceptualism, community and collaborative practices, and so forth. The artist's flight might also be a flight from the studio, from art's conventional materials and formats, from humdrum artistic work. Secondly, ethnopolitically, there's no reference in either documentation or exhibitions to Thailand. Though his collaborators are compatriots, and this surely determines their rapport, the setting is transnational, and the project, commissioned by European institutions and never shown in Thailand, sidesteps the national frame of interpretation. In any case, their affinities are subnational. Like Pratyah, these workers are from Isan, or the northeast of Thailand. Historically, a non-state buffer zone, encompassed loosely over centuries and only decisively with the establishment of modern states in response to colonialism, as well as the internal colonisation of the fifth reign. This is King Chulalongkorn's reign, the monarch known most for the kind of modern administrative reform that gave birth to Thailand as a nation. His reign is, I think, 1868 until about 1910. This region, Isan, accounts for about 1/3 of Thailand's land and population, but its GDP per capita is only 1/3 of the national average. Though most Isan people were, at least until last October, proud subjects of the Bangkok monarch, they've benefited less than anyone from the modern state's centralisation of power and surplus, consistently getting the rough end of the environmental, political and economic sticks. They have a history of resisting political domination and military conscription by central Siamese bureaucracy, and economic domination by Sino-Thai agribusiness and all that comes with it: debt and dispossession, privatisation of genetic resources, reliance on costly and toxic pesticides, etc. All the iniquities of big-time monoculture. For want of better opportunities, much of Isan's economy has remained agrarian, despite being drier and less fertile than other regions. Its workforce is the most seasonal and also the most mobile in the country. So its underemployed rice farmers are an obvious labour pool for this overseas work, for which their physiognomy is suited, their bodies are already trained, and the price is right. Theirs is a flight not to further altitude, but to further latitudes. It's still seasonal, but now orbital, subject to multiple interwoven state regimes. Despite extortion by unscrupulous brokers, they remove themselves from a poverty trap with clear ethno-national dimensions. But the freedom to roam turns out to be a chimera. The European commons, ironically, a site of recapture. What became of the Zomian instinct after decolonization, after encompassment, enclosure, and urbanization? In the time remaining, I'm going to attempt a quick sketch of a few of modern and contemporary art's sublimated escape routes. This is not comprehensive in any way. I just want to try to start imagining how we could reorganize these fields, seeing them through this fugitive lens. I've divided this kind of arbitrarily into three planes of withdrawal. The first, the plane of narrative, is the most obvious. The fugitive paradigm suggests revision of an idiom that was the hallmark of Southeast Asian contemporary art in its emergent phase, the 1990s. That is, when it came to be called both contemporary and Southeast Asian, and not instead of Thai, Indonesian, Vietnamese, but by virtue of that very national identification. An idiom that has since been canonized by way of survey shows and regionally framed collections. Through allegory, artists encoded and encrypted national problems, dodging taboos and regulation, not least state monopolization of media, which is still practically the norm in the region in some ways, to serve up non-frontal political critique to knowing counterpublics. This was the idiom of some important critical art during the twilight of Cold War authoritarianism, on both sides of that ideological divide. But it proved susceptible to instrumentalization once bureaucratic investments in contemporary art began in the 2000s. Nowhere was the recuperation more dramatic than in Thailand, where those critics have been aligned with very conservative state forces since. My book on Thai contemporary art, which is outside, product placement, was broadly about what came next. It's pretty much a study of what followed this, the struggles of the next cohort to try to move beyond the national frame of reference whilst retaining some critical purchase on national situations. In brief, I'll isolate here just a number of their overlapping strategies. First, a radicalization of allegory, in which it becomes far less legible as artists destabilize the formal frames and boundaries of the artwork itself as a way of disrupting and trying to cast off representational norms. Also, an obvious return to narrative, to revive and rechannel vernacular modes of storytelling, particularly oral and fictional ones, rather than competing, say, in a documentary idiom with the official record. Apichatpong Wirasetakun exemplifies this strategy, as well as a third one, a new kind of figuration and embodiment, a hauntology, especially palpable in the moving image, in which Cold War national historical trauma began all of a sudden and all over the region to be revisited early this century. This return, too pronounced to be accidental, suggests that even where Southeast Asians have not quite shared historical experiences, they nevertheless share ways of experiencing history. And it raises questions, why now? Why now and not in the 1990s when the settings of Cold War repression eased? To what extent might the identitarian fixations of the 90s have been a repression of that Cold War experience? This is my suggestion of how this fugitive lens might help us to respin the art history of that period. Okay, a second plane of withdrawal, which doesn't have pictures. A centrifugal political geography makes some sense to social anthropologists. So the second plane I have in mind is, I would say, psychosocial. Social anthropologists have long wondered why the Siamese, that is the state-encompassed people, always an ethnocultural mélange, have historically enjoyed great social cohesion despite their relatively high degree of personal autonomy. One scholar proposed a theory of negative individualism to explain this contradiction. A mode of retreat, I quote from a fellow named Hanten Brummelhuis, a mode of retreat, avoidance, and distrust which colours many forms of social behaviour in Thailand. Now, anyone who's worked there to this day could attest to the Thais' generous but ultimately non-committal and temporary ways of collaborating. I'm skeptical about that kind of social science, but I think it rightly links interpersonal strategies of association and avoidance to the old political dynamic of periodic flight into the forests and ungoverned hinterlands. A Zomian withdrawal from the interfaces of worldly power brings autonomy, which, commuted to the subject of the bounded modern nation, where physical withdrawal is no longer an option, becomes negative individualism, a retiring, self-administered conformity that favours flexibility over confrontation. This could explain why contemporary artists, from whom a certain positive individualism might be expected, acquire more stature through excursions beyond the national sphere instead. It would also explain the non-oppositional nature, generally speaking, of the Thai vanguard, figures like Rakrit Thiravanit, Surasi Kusalwong, and indeed Apichatpong, all of them masters of a kind of wry subversion, but who seldom take legible oppositional stances on contentious issues. In the study of art, individualism has, of course, been a quintessentially modern attribute, a characterization then broadly imported into Asia, even though we know that individualism has distinct resonance and histories there, while few art institutions, especially state ones, have enshrined it as a guiding value. A more nuanced individualism that accommodates both distinction and withdrawal will better describe the professional postures that modern artists have struck. This is very much the terrain of misfits, incidentally, so I will put in a quick plug for those of you who will be in Berlin at the end of this month. We will have another weekend program more focused on that exhibition. We need to rethink in detail artists' avoidance of the Academy's coercive patronage and bureaucratization, of its unreflexive pedagogies, and its monolithic chauvinist narratives. This suggests a revised geography of modern art, while there's perhaps something inherent to the structure of art's globalization that permits the expression of the flight instinct. Provincial vectors have been no less important. Paibun Suwanakut, for instance, was a conscientious objector from the National Academy in Thailand. He was a member of the first cohort of Sin Birasi, the Italian fellow who set up the National Art School. But he refused to follow through and graduate as a student of the institution later on. And he spearheaded a temple mural revival that underpinned the neo-traditionalism that later dominated both official and market patronage in the 1980s. This individualist's mode of production was broadly collectivist. His escape trajectory was provincial and traditional. This reminds me of something that Chan Kyong Park, one of the artists in the Tigers show, said in the first weekend program, that post-war retirement in Korean modern art, some of the post-war retirements to mountainous retreats and to traditional Korean idioms weren't always necessarily to be read as indicative of conservatism. Another Silapakon refusnik, Utit Atimana, was the prime mover behind the transnational artist-run festival, the Chiang Mai Social Installation, which ran from about 92 till about 1998, a collective rejection of national institutional norms, leveraging Chiang Mai's status as a halfway house for recuperated leftists following the general amnesty that was declared in the early 1980s. He also co-founded, not incidentally, the Land Foundation in 1998. These two projects alone have been sufficient to make Chiang Mai the main antipodal alternative for those wishing to withdraw from the centre of art institutional power. Apologies for the crappy slides. Scanning regionally, we find similar withdrawals, too numerous to mention. All manner of returns to the village, both literal and figurative, like, for example, Mulyono's community workshopping in East and Central Java, like the Artists' Guild in the upland retreat of Baguio in the Philippine Cordillera, whose festivals since the late 80s married localist rather than nationalist celebrations of indigenous cultures with international contemporary forms. And even perhaps the Artist Village in the outskirts of Singapore, the disappearing fringes of Singapore, and their brief but fertile occupation of a defunct poultry farm. This is from about 1988 to 1989. Most of these examples were not disavowals of state cultural administration. Indeed, they went on to seek state patronage and became quasi-institutional. But all yielded relative autonomy, which would prove important for rooting around the regulation and rationalization going on in the officialized sphere of modern art. This regional culture of independence was, I would argue, a key ingredient of contemporaneity in Southeast Asia. And it harks back not to Courbet or the Salon des Indépendants, but to another kind of autonomy that is much, much older than modern art. Reiko Tomii, a Japanese scholar, will speak also in the next program about some outsiders operating deliberately beyond Japanese art's metropolitan centres. Her radicals in the wilderness, as she puts it, suggest ways of resetting the criteria of contemporaneity in art history, suspending comparison with Western vanguard benchmarks. The third plane of withdrawal, and this is where I'll kind of conclude, might seem to take us away from art somewhat. Those political, social, physical withdrawals that I've been talking about have analogues in spiritual practice and religious geography as well. Thai Buddhism holds the most obvious quotidian evidence of a withdrawal reflex and how it may have been institutionalized and generalized. Ordination is a formal and actual withdrawal from the world, still undertaken by almost every adult Thai male, though the clerical life, once the only means of attaining education, has had less and less vocational appeal. From a Western standpoint, it seems counterintuitive, but in Siam, religion was a key vector of modernization, pivotal in the rationalization and centralization of modern political power. Take, for example, the Thammayut order, founded by the fourth Bangkok king, Mongkut, before he took the throne in 1833. There's a picture of him here taken somewhat later than that, in which his days in the monkhood are being recalled or rechanneled. So this order became a potent elite enjoying disproportionate influence thanks to its royal patronage. This austere orthodox sect was a vehicle for streamlining and centralizing Theravadan religious authority at a time when, beyond a few of the larger towns, the temple was often the only institutional link to the administrative centre. They professed to rid Siamese Buddhism of the many other faith traditions that had become embedded within it. They decried superstition, magic, and ancestral worship. They were emissaries of rationalism, of intellectual modernity, when the nation was still just a concept awaiting actualization. If the Thammayut were agents of a nascent state, the archetypal fugitives were the heterodox monks of the so-called forest tradition, itinerant ascetics who wore recycled robes, ate one donated meal per day, and generally eschewed worldly affairs, spending much of every year walking and meditating in the wilderness. Forest monks believe in practice, not theory. They were known for practicing magic. They derived their power and special charisma not from political or symbolic association or patronage, but from mastery of arcane and even occult practices, and from their radical disavowal of worldly power and material comforts. They were often distrusted by villagers and not infrequently taken for were-tigers. But while their practices were basically antithetical to the Tamayut orthodoxy, far from being opposed, in fact, the two enjoyed a very special synergy. From the end of the 19th century, the most charismatic of the forest monks, most of whom were Lao or Isan, not Siamese, were reordained in the central Tamayut order, which successfully instrumentalized them then as boundary riders, trailblazers who could establish footholds, hermitages, small temples and monasteries at the very fringes of civilization. These footholds were then funded and staffed from the central clerical administration, sort of following in their footsteps. And those centres, which may have begun as a kind of cave shrine, but gradually was sort of funded into the grown-up form of a temple, rose very quickly through the ranks, and this is where the kind of clerical architecture, if you like, maps very closely with the political architecture of the state as it's extending its reach into the provinces. So they would rise, these outposts would rise very quickly in the ranks through town to city, from outpost, from village to town to city. If the Tamayut were the foot soldiers of a national encompassment, rationalization and modernity, the wanderers were literally its vanguard. The relationship was tested in the Cold War somewhat, with some gurus branded as communists, but the domesticated ones thrived, and by the 1980s, some of these people, and this is the second and third generation deriving from this fellow on the right, Prajan Manpuritat, some of these people by the 80s commanded a network of 60 or 80 temples nationwide. They became tremendously powerful. They were also, after that, and perhaps not incidentally, Thai Buddhism's most successful international export. So if you've met a backpacker who's become enamored of Siamese Buddhism, it's very likely that this strand of religion has seduced them. The parallels with modern art, I think, are pretty clear. And though I won't go into kind of laboured detail here, I note that many of Thailand's most esteemed contemporary artists, and this is a sort of conspiracy theory that I flesh out a little in the book, especially the ones that are known for so-called relational and other heterodox practices, have ties to this forest tradition. Indeed, modern art's independence and its instrumentalization have proceeded along rather similar lines, with a similar dynamics of perhaps transgression, incorporation, and resistance, of a non-mortal opposition, very much in line with the political geography that James described yesterday. Evasion, be it religious, artistic, political, or all of the above, is never absolute or final. It's one side of a continuous negotiation. And though art's geography may be more and more global, the invisible force fields that organise it may still be those of the state. Thank you very much.